100 emergency service workers have travelled to the Kimberley.
Severe damage to homes and infrastructure.
All eyes are on the vast Kimberley region this morning as the Prime Minister and Premier fly in to assess the damage from the worst flooding in the region's history.
We've seen people and spoken to people who've lost their homes, who've lost their livelihoods, who are doing it really tough, but they're resilient. They're determined to build back in this community.
The Commissioner and I have been talking about what happens next.
The roads and the bridges were heavily damaged, and we'll put every resource we can into getting them fixed as soon as we can.
We're talking about a completely saturated landscape out there, and that's going to take a long time to drain away, and any rain we get now between now and the end of the monsoon in sort of March, April is it's just going to go straight to flooding straight away.
And the Prime Minister joins me now live from Broome. Welcome to the program, Prime Minister.
Good evening, David.
Now, the scale of this flooding is creating some enormous logistical difficulties. Are you satisfied the emergency needs, food, clothing, medical supplies, are getting through to the communities who need them, particularly some of those remote communities?
Well, this is a massive logistical challenge. You have places like Fitzroy Crossing, but also Derby, as well as a range of other very small remote communities that have been cut off. That the roads aren't usable. The bridge into Fitzroy Crossing has basically been destroyed. So the only way that goods can be got in at the moment is by air, and that presents some challenges. But I must say that the emergency services personnel here in Western Australia, combined with volunteers, combined with the Australian Defence Force, there'll be almost 200 people on the ground by tomorrow. They have 8 aircraft on the ground here in the Kimberley, 3 fixed-wing aircraft and 5 helicopters from the ADF. There is enormous work being done, and the community that I met with today was just incredibly resilient. They're determined to build back even stronger than they were before, and they're working together.
We have seen major flooding events now in, I think, nearly every state in the relatively short time you've been Prime Minister. We're told to expect more frequent and more severe natural disasters as well. Is this causing you to rethink whether communities are well enough prepared? And listening to you list some of the response there, whether Defence has the resources that it needs?
Well, we'll give communities every support that they need, and my government will always stand with communities in the face of natural disasters wherever they're occurring. In the short period in which I have been Prime Minister, I've visited the Riverland in South Australia, I've visited a number of communities in New South Wales, of course around Forbes, up on the north coast around Lismore. I've visited Rochester and Bendigo in Victoria. I've visited northern Tasmania. The science told us that our climate is changing, that there'll be more extreme events and they'll be more intense, and that is what is happening. We've always had, of course, natural disasters here in Australia, but the intensity of them, it's quite clear, is becoming more severe. We're just 1/3 of the way through the wet season here in the Kimberley, and that's why there's a watching brief, and the experts here are being very cautious about the months ahead.
Let me turn to some of the other big issues you're going to be facing this year, Prime Minister. You plan to hold a referendum to enshrine an Indigenous voice to Parliament in the Constitution. The Nationals have already declared their opposition. The Liberals are demanding more detail. What do you plan to do between now and the referendum to ensure its success? What are the next steps from here?
Well, the important thing here is, David, that this is a bottom-up process. Remember that this began in 2012. There was 5 years in the lead up to the Uluru Statement from the Heart being developed, overwhelmingly endorsed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people after consultations and literally hundreds and hundreds of meetings right around the country. Then you had a Joint Select Committee report to the Parliament in 2018. It was jointly chaired by Pat Dodson and Julian Leeser, who's now the Shadow Minister for Aboriginal Affairs, as well as the Shadow Attorney General, about how a voice to Parliament might operate. You then had the coalition government establish a process co-chaired by Tom Calma and Marcia Langton that produced a more than 260-page report that Ken Wyatt took to the Cabinet not once but twice. So there's an enormous amount of detail out there. What I intend to do is to work with people of goodwill. But it's very clear, David, that there's a range of things that are completely agreed upon. One is that a voice should look at matters that affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, how we close the gap in health and education and housing, how we make a difference there. The second thing that is in the draft wording of the proposals I've put forward at the Gama Festival that you attended, of course, is that the voice will be subservient to the Parliament. That is, Parliament will continue to control the destiny.
So just on that, Prime Minister, sorry to interrupt, but is it still your intent to put to the Australian people the principle of a voice to Parliament and leave that detail for Parliament to work out in the event of a yes vote?
Well, the way that our Constitution works, David, is that you have the principles of the way that our Constitution, our nation's birth certificate operate. There isn't actually even a recognition of the position of Prime Minister in the Constitution at the moment. So it's a simple proposition that we recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in our Constitution and that they have a voice, that they be consulted. I regard it as good manners. But it's also very clear that the reason why some of the debate is disingenuous at the moment about detail is that it misses the whole point. For 120 years since we federated, we've had the Australian government do things for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, often with the best of intentions. What this idea is pretty simple, that we'll do it with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
Understand that
this
principle.
Isn't my proposal, this is the people's proposal, and I very consciously in that Gama speech didn't say, here's the words, this is the government's position. I said, here is draft words. If you have a better idea, then I'm certainly open to ways in which if people think that there are improvements that can be made, then by all means.
And so you have now set up
come forward with them.
You've set up the working group and the engagement group that are doing that work and looking at what further information is needed for a successful referendum. When will you or the rest of us see those reports, and what do you expect them to include?
Well, they're doing the work through about how the voice could operate, but doing it in being informed by the work that's already been done. See, will
those reports be made public once they're done?
Of course, just like people can log on now and look at the report of Tom Calma and Marcia Langton. They can look at the interim report that the committee co-chaired by Julian Leeser, who's now responsible for Indigenous Affairs.
But you have not committed to those reports
in the coalition.
To be clear, though, they're not proposals that you have accepted.
Because what we are doing here, David, is trying to get and reach out and get as much support as possible. We want this to be an inclusive process, and people can either look for a way in which this can be given support, or they can look for reasons to disagree and look for division. I want to look for national unity. I have made that very clear, and that's why I've met with Peter Dutton on a number of occasions, and that's why I was disappointed to pick up the paper and read that apparently he had written to me, but he forgot to actually write to me. He just gave it to the newspapers, which is the first time that I heard about this correspondence. And to me, that isn't fair income. If you're fair income, sit down, work issues through, come up with a constructive proposal.
Just on another matter, Prime Minister, in the next few months you'll announce which nuclear submarine Australia is going to go for under the AUKUS agreement. Two influential US senators have raised some concerns about the capacity to build Australian subs over there. Former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull today has said that any nuclear submarine that we acquire from the US will not be able to be operated or maintained without the supervision of the US Navy. Is he right?
Now, I'm very confident that we can come up with an outcome that serves Australia's national defence interests as well as serves the interests of the United Kingdom and the United States. That's what the whole point of the AUKUS arrangement is, to recognise that through cooperation in our defence systems, we can, each of the three countries, be stronger. And it's also a recognition that we are working through of how we increase our capability. I want for submarines to actually be manufactured here in Australia. I want to see the skills that will come from that benefit not just the marine industry, but to have benefit right across the board, just as the automotive industry
but to be clear,
used to.
Will Australia
play that
maintain
role.
sovereignty over the maintenance and operation of all of these submarines?
We are being very clear that Australia's sovereign interests will be protected in any arrangements that we enter into, and that is something that the United States wants to protect its interests, in the UK as well. But what we're talking about here is more cooperation, including cooperation on technology. It's not surprising that these two US representatives have made the statement that they have, but it is also the case that senior members of the US administration have been extremely positive towards the reform that is occurring. I've met, of course, with President Biden on 4 occasions since I've been elected as Prime Minister, and I've met with 3 UK Prime Ministers who all have in common their support for this agreement.
Okay. Prime Minister, we will have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, David.